The rain had been falling for 17 days now, turning the blessed mud fields of St. Erasmus Ridge into a slurry of consecrated earth and rotting flesh. Corporal Heinrich Mordian crouched in the forward observation trench, his fingers wrapped around the stock of his blessed Mauser rifle, watching the gray expanse of no man's land through a crack in the sandbags. The corpse candles flickered weakly in their iron sconces along the trench walls, their pale flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The war had been grinding on for 8 centuries now, ever since Hellgate Jerusalem had torn open and spilled its corruption across the Holy Land. Heinrich's grandfather had fought here, and his grandfather before him, generation after generation of Mordians bleeding into this cursed soil for the glory of the new syncretic Orthodox Church. The trenches stretched from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, a sprawling network of blessed fortifications and sepulchres where the faithful held the line against the endless tide of heretics and damned. Heinrich shifted his weight, feeling the familiar ache in his knees from kneeling on the wooden duckboards. The smell of wet earth and decay filled his nostrils, mixed with the acrid smoke from the relic engines that powered their defensive positions. Somewhere in the distance, the rhythmic thump of artillery echoed across the battlefield, a mechanical heartbeat that never ceased. Mordian. The voice belonged to Sergeant Erasmus Clough, a grizzled veteran whose face bore the ritual scars of 3 decades of trench warfare, movement in Sector 7, something coming up from the Hebrew night positions. Heinrich adjusted his position and peered through his field glasses. Through the swirling mist and rain, he could make out a figure moving slowly across the cratered landscape. It was a man in the robes of a preacher knight, walking with measured steps through the shell holes and barbed wire. What struck Heinrich as odd was the complete silence of his approach. No footsteps squelched in the mud, no breathing misted in the cold air. "Is he one of ours?" Heinrich whispered. Clough spat into the mud. "Can't tell from this distance, but something ain't right about him." The figure drew closer, and Heinrich could see that he wore a bronze mask that covered the upper half of his face. The metal was tarnished and green with age, worked with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering light of the corpse candles. His robes were the deep burgundy of the Orthodox Church, but they hung strangely on his frame, as if the man beneath had somehow diminished. As the preacher knight reached the edge of their defensive line, Heinrich felt something odd happen inside his skull. It was not a sound exactly, but a pressure, a sensation of words forming without being spoken. The feeling was warm and comforting, like a father's blessing or a mother's lullaby. "Children of the faith," the words bloomed inside Heinrich's mind. "You have suffered long in this blessed war. Your sacrifice has not gone unnoticed by the saints above." Heinrich blinked, confused. The bronze-masked figure had not moved his lips, had not made any sound at all, yet the words had been as clear as if spoken directly into his ear. Around him, other soldiers were beginning to emerge from their positions, drawn by something they could not name. "I bring you benedictions from the highest orders of the Church," the soundless voice continued. "Your commander has requested that you gather for evening prayers." But they had not been scheduled for evening prayers. Heinrich knew the duty roster by heart. Still, something in those unspoken words made him feel that it was right, that this was what he was supposed to do. He found himself rising from his crouch, his rifle hanging forgotten at his side. Clough was moving too, his scarred face slack with an expression of peaceful contentment. All around them, soldiers were emerging from bunkers and trenches, forming into neat ranks without being ordered to do so. The bronze-masked preacher stood at the center of their formation, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. Heinrich took his place in the formation, feeling a warmth spreading through his chest. This was good. This was right. The preacher's presence filled him with a sense of purpose he had not felt since his first days in the trenches. Here was someone who understood their sacrifice, who could guide them to greater glory. "You have served faithfully," the voice whispered in their minds, "but greater service awaits. The enemy grows bold in their positions beyond the wire. They mock the faith with their presence. They defile the blessed earth with their heretical footsteps. Heinrich nodded along with the others. Yes, the heretics had grown too bold. Something needed to be done about them. He could feel the righteous anger building in his chest, mixing with the strange warmth that had taken hold of him. "Tonight, we shall show them the true meaning of faith," the preacher continued. "We shall walk among them as angels of judgment, bringing the light of the church into their dark places." The words made perfect sense. Heinrich could see it now, a vision of himself and his brothers in arms moving through the enemy trenches like avenging spirits, their faith protecting them from harm. It would be glorious. It would be holy. The preacher knight raised one gloved hand, and Heinrich felt a surge of euphoria wash over him. This was what he had been waiting for his entire life. This was his true calling. When the star shells bloom overhead, the voice instructed, "You will know it is time. Walk forward with courage in your hearts, for you are the blessed of the church. No harm can come to those who serve with perfect faith." Heinrich smiled, feeling tears of joy streaming down his face. Around him, his fellow soldiers wore the same expression of blissful certainty. They understood now. They had been chosen for something magnificent. As the bronze-masked preacher melted back into the mist and rain, Heinrich returned to his position with a light heart. He cleaned his rifle with unusual care, checked his ammunition, and waited for the sign. When the star shells bloomed, he would be ready. Hours passed. Heinrich found himself humming a hymn he could not remember learning, the melody flowing through his mind like honey. Beside him, Clough was doing the same thing, their voices harmonizing perfectly without conscious effort. All along the trench line, he could hear the same wordless song rising from his brothers in arms. When the first star shell burst overhead, bathing no man's land in harsh white light, Heinrich felt his heart leap with anticipation. This was it. This was the moment they had been preparing for their entire lives. Without hesitation, he climbed up and over the parapet, his rifle held at the ready. Behind him, he could hear the sound of dozens of other men doing the same. They moved in perfect formation across the shell-torn ground, their faces serene with absolute faith. The enemy machine guns opened fire almost immediately. Heinrich saw muzzle flashes winking like malevolent stars in the darkness ahead. He heard the whistle and snap of bullets passing close to his head, but he felt no fear, only a deep sense of righteous purpose. Beside him, Private Tessler stumbled and fell, his chest torn open by machine gun fire. But even as he died, Tessler's face maintained that same expression of peaceful joy, his lips still moving in silent prayer. Heinrich stepped over his fallen comrade and continued forward, his smile never wavering. More men fell around him. The enemy artillery had found their range now, and high explosive shells were bursting among their ranks. Heinrich felt hot metal fragments tear through his uniform, felt warm blood running down his arms, but the pain seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was reaching the enemy lines, bringing the light of faith into their dark places. As they drew closer to the heretic trenches, Heinrich could see faces peering over the parapet. Hebrew knights, their distinctive blue and white surcoats stained with mud and blood. Their eyes were wide with terror and confusion. They were screaming something, but Heinrich could not make out the words over the sound of gunfire. One of them was waving a white flag, trying to signal surrender. Heinrich felt a moment of pity for the poor heretic. Did he not understand that there could be no surrender? This was not a battle in the conventional sense. This was a cleansing, a purification of the blessed earth. Heinrich reached the edge of the enemy trench and looked down at the cowering soldiers below. They were young men, barely old enough to carry rifles, their faces painted with ritual symbols that marked them as followers of the Hebrew faith. In their eyes he could see the darkness of their heresy, the corruption that had led them away from the true path. "Peace be upon you, brothers," Heinrich whispered as he raised his rifle. "May the church have mercy on your souls." He fired once, twice, 3 times. Each shot was a prayer, each death a small victory for the faith. Around him, his fellow soldiers were doing the same. methodically working their way through the enemy positions with the calm efficiency of men performing a holy duty. It was only when Heinrich paused to reload that he noticed something strange. The Hebrew knights were not fighting back. They were huddled in the corners of their trenches, weeping and begging in their foreign tongue. Some had thrown down their weapons entirely. Others were trying to climb out of the trenches, fleeing across no man's land toward their own rear lines. For a moment, Heinrich felt a flicker of doubt. This was not how battles were supposed to unfold. The enemy should be fighting back, should be trying to defend their positions. Instead, they seemed terrified beyond reason, as if they were facing something far more horrible than mere soldiers. But then the warm voice in his head spoke again, washing away his doubts with gentle reassurance. "You are the instruments of divine will," it whispered. "Their terror is proof of the righteousness of your cause. Continue your holy work." Heinrich smiled and continued firing. The voice was right, of course. The enemy's fear was a sign of their spiritual weakness, their inability to face the true servants of the church. He and his brothers were blessed warriors, protected by their perfect faith. As dawn broke over the battlefield, Heinrich found himself standing in a trench filled with bodies. His uniform was soaked with blood, both his own and that of his enemies. His hands shook slightly as he tried to light a cigarette, the adrenaline of battle finally beginning to ebb. Around him, his surviving comrades were going through the enemy positions, collecting weapons and intelligence. They moved with the same calm efficiency they had shown during the attack, their faces still wearing that expression of serene contentment. "Good work, boys," Sergeant Clough called out, his voice filled with paternal pride. "The preacher will be pleased with our success." Heinrich nodded, feeling a warm glow of satisfaction in his chest. They had done well. They had served faithfully. The bronze-masked preacher had been right to trust them with this holy mission. It was only later, as he sat in the captured enemy bunker drinking lukewarm coffee, that Heinrich began to notice the first signs that something was wrong. The warmth in his chest had faded, replaced by a cold emptiness that made him feel hollow and sick. His hands would not stop shaking, no matter how tightly he gripped his rifle. More troubling was the silence. The Hebrew Knights had operated a powerful radio station from this position, and their communications equipment was still intact. But when Heinrich tried to tune into the enemy frequencies, he heard nothing but static. No reports of the attack, no calls for reinforcement or medical assistance, nothing at all. "Clough," he called out to his sergeant. "Shouldn't we be hearing something from their command? Distress calls, at least." The older man looked up from the map he was studying, his scarred face creased with confusion. "Now that you mention it, that is strange. Maybe their equipment is broken." But as the hours passed, the silence grew more oppressive. No counterattack came. No enemy aircraft appeared overhead to strafe their new positions. It was as if the Hebrew Knights had simply vanished from the face of the earth. When the relief column arrived that evening, Heinrich was shocked to see the expression of horror on Captain Mueller's face. The company commander stood at the edge of the trench, staring down at the piles of enemy dead with undisguised revulsion. "Corporal Mordian," Mueller's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "What happened here?" Heinrich straightened to attention, confused by his superior's tone. "We carried out the mission, sir. The preacher knight ordered us to clear the enemy positions, and we obeyed." "What preacher knight?" Mueller demanded. "There are no preacher knights assigned to this sector." The words hit Heinrich like a physical blow. No preacher knights assigned to this sector. But that was impossible. He had seen the bronze-masked figure with his own eyes, had heard his voice speaking directly into his mind. The mission had been real. The benedictions had been real. "Sir," Heinrich struggled to find the words. "He was here. He spoke to us. He gave us our orders." Mueller's face darkened. "Corporal, I want you to look around this trench and tell me what you see." Heinrich looked around, suddenly seeing the scene with new eyes. The Hebrew Knights had not died in battle. They had died cowering in corners, shot down like animals while trying to surrender. Some of the bodies showed signs of close-range execution. Others appeared to have been killed while fleeing. This was not a battle, Mueller continued, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. This was a massacre. These men were trying to surrender, and you butchered them like cattle. The words made no sense. Heinrich could remember the attack clearly. The enemy had been fighting back. They had been dangerous heretics who needed to be stopped. The preacher had explained it all so clearly. But as he stared down at the body of a young Hebrew knight, no older than 18, Heinrich felt the first crack appear in his certainty. The boy's hands were raised in supplication, frozen in the moment of his death. There was no weapon near his body, no ammunition, nothing to suggest he had been anything other than a terrified child begging for his life. "Get these men out of here," Mueller ordered the relief troops. "I want them taken back to headquarters for questioning." As Heinrich was led away from the captured trench, he found himself looking back over his shoulder, searching for some sign of the bronze-masked preacher. But there was nothing there except empty air and the lingering smell of death. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Heinrich sat in a cold stone cell beneath the command bunker, trying to explain what had happened to a succession of increasingly skeptical officers. He told them about the preacher knight, about the voice that spoke without words, about the sense of holy purpose that had filled him during the attack. They did not believe him. Corporal Mordian, Colonel Voss leaned forward across the interrogation table, his eyes cold and hard. "There is no record of any preacher knight being assigned to your sector. There is no record of any special orders being issued for an attack on the Hebrew positions. What you and your men did was an unprovoked massacre of enemy soldiers who were attempting to surrender." Heinrich shook his head desperately. "Sir, I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The preacher was real. Then where is he now?" Voss demanded. "If this preacher knight exists, why has he not come forward to verify your story?" Heinrich had no answer for that. He had been asking himself the same question for 3 days now, and the silence was eating away at his sanity like acid. On the 4th day, they brought in Sergeant Clough for a joint interrogation. The older man looked haggard and confused, his scarred face pale with exhaustion. But when he saw Heinrich, his eyes lit up with recognition. "Heinrich, boy." Clough's voice was filled with relief. "Tell them about the preacher. Tell them how he saved us." "Saved you?" Colonel Voss raised an eyebrow. "From what?" Clough blinked, confusion clouding his features. From... He struggled for words, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I can't remember. But he saved us. I know he saved us." The interrogation continued for another hour, but neither man could provide any coherent explanation for their actions. The story of the bronze-masked preacher remained consistent, but there was no evidence to support it. No other witnesses, no official orders. Nothing but the word of 2 soldiers who had participated in what could only be described as a war crime. In the end, they were both sentenced to punishment duty in the deep trenches, the forward positions where life expectancy was measured in weeks rather than months. It was a death sentence disguised as mercy, a chance to redeem themselves through suffering and sacrifice. As Heinrich was led to his new position in the front lines, he caught a glimpse of movement in the mist ahead. For a moment, his heart leaped with hope. Perhaps the preacher had returned. Perhaps he would explain everything, make the officers understand the truth. But when the figure emerged from the fog, Heinrich's blood turned to ice in his veins. It was not the bronze-masked preacher. It was something else entirely. Something that wore the torn remains of a Hebrew knight's uniform, its body riddled with bullet holes that wept black blood. Its face was a ruin of shattered bone and torn flesh, but its eyes still burned with an unholy light. "You remember me," the thing whispered, its voice like the sound of dirt falling on a coffin lid. "You put these holes in my chest. You watched me die." Heinrich tried to scream, but no sound would come. The creature shambled closer, leaving footprints of black ichor in the mud. Behind it, Heinrich could see other shapes moving in the mist. More dead Hebrew knights, all bearing the wounds that he and his comrades had inflicted upon them. "We have been waiting," the creature continued, "waiting for you to understand. The preacher you thought you saw, the voice you thought you heard, they were never real. There was only us, only the dead calling out for justice." The truth hit Heinrich like a physical blow. The warmth he had felt, the sense of righteous purpose, the certainty that he was doing God's work, it had all been an illusion. A shared madness that had allowed him and his comrades to commit atrocities while telling themselves they were heroes. But if that was true, then what had caused the madness? What had made them all hear the same voice, see the same figure? As if reading his thoughts, the dead Hebrew knight smiled, revealing teeth stained black with grave dirt. "You want to know what spoke to you that night? You want to know what whispered such sweet lies into your eager minds?" The creature raised one decaying hand and pointed behind Heinrich. Slowly, dreading what he would see, Heinrich turned around. There, standing in the entrance to the trench, was the bronze-masked preacher. But now Heinrich could see him clearly, without the veil of madness that had clouded his perception before. The figure's robes were not the burgundy of the Orthodox Church, but the deep black of the heretic legions. The bronze mask was not worked with holy symbols, but with the twisted sigils of Hellgate Jerusalem. And where the preacher's mouth should have been, there was nothing but smooth metal. No lips, no teeth, no tongue. Just polished bronze that reflected Heinrich's terrified face back at him in miniature. "I am the Cantor of no tongue." The thing spoke without speaking, its voice echoing inside Heinrich's skull like a death knell. "I sing the songs that turn faith into madness, hope into despair, righteousness into atrocity. You heard my voice and thought it was God's. You followed my commands and thought them holy." Heinrich fell to his knees in the mud, his rifle clattering forgotten beside him. Around him, he could hear the sound of his fellow soldiers screaming, though whether they were screams of terror or ecstasy, he could not tell. "Why?" Heinrich whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Why did you make us do those things?" The Cantor tilted his bronze-masked head, as if considering the question. "Because it pleased me," he replied simply. "Because your faith was so pure, so absolute, that it became a weapon I could turn against itself. You wanted so desperately to serve God that you were willing to serve anything that spoke with his voice." The dead Hebrew knights were drawing closer now, their wounds gaping like hungry mouths. Heinrich could smell the stench of decay that clung to their shambling forms, could hear the wet squelch of their footsteps in the blessed mud of St. Erasmus Ridge. "Please," Heinrich begged. "I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing." "Oh, but you did know," the Cantor corrected him gently. "In your heart, you knew that something was wrong. You saw them trying to surrender. You heard their pleas for mercy. But you chose to ignore those signs because my voice promised you that you were righteous, that you were blessed, that you were chosen." Heinrich tried to protest, but the words died in his throat. The Cantor was right. He had seen the terror in the Hebrew knights' eyes. He had heard their cries for mercy. But he had chosen to interpret those signs as proof of their spiritual weakness, their inability to face the servants of God. "The human heart is such a fragile thing," the Cantor mused, his bronze face gleaming in the flickering light of the corpse candles. "It wants so desperately to believe in its own goodness that it will accept any lie, no matter how transparent, as long as that lie allows it to continue feeling righteous." The first of the dead Hebrew knights reached Heinrich, its blackened fingers closing around his throat. The creature's grip was cold as winter earth, and Heinrich could feel his life being slowly squeezed away. But even as darkness closed in around the edges of his vision, he could hear the Cantor's voice continuing to speak. "You are not the first, Heinrich Mordian. There have been others before you, and there will be others after. Faithful soldiers who hear my voice and mistake it for the voice of God. Righteous men who commit atrocities in the name of heaven. This is my gift to the war, my contribution to the endless conflict that has consumed this holy land for 800 years. Heinrich's vision began to fade, But just before the darkness claimed him completely, he saw something that made his dying heart surge with one final moment of hope. There, emerging from the mist at the far end of the trench, was a figure in the true burgundy robes of the Orthodox Church, a real preacher knight, his face uncovered, his expression filled with holy wrath. "Release him, abomination," the newcomer commanded, his voice ringing with genuine divine authority. "Your corruption ends here." The cantor turned to face this new threat, and for the first time since Heinrich had encountered him, the creature seemed uncertain. "Father Matias," he acknowledged, his toneless voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "I wondered when you would find me. Your trail of madness and atrocity was not difficult to follow," Father Matias replied, drawing a blessed silver sword from beneath his robes. 3 companies of faithful soldiers turned into butchers, 4 enemy positions overrun by men who thought they were doing God's work. How many more will you corrupt before you are satisfied? "As many as it takes," the cantor replied simply. "The war must continue. The faithful must be tested. The line between good and evil must remain blurred until no one can tell the difference between salvation and damnation." Father Matias raised his sword, and Heinrich could see holy light beginning to gather around the blade. "Then I will end your corrupt influence here and now." But even as the priest advanced, Heinrich could see that it was too late. The cantor was already beginning to fade, his form becoming translucent in the mist. The dead Hebrew knights were dissolving as well, their vengeful spirits returning to whatever hell had spawned them. "You cannot stop me, priest." The cantor's voice was growing fainter now, echoing from a greater and greater distance. "I am everywhere that faith exists without understanding, everywhere that righteousness exists without wisdom. I am the voice in the darkness that tells good men to do evil things for holy reasons." The last thing Heinrich saw before death finally claimed him was the look of terrible understanding that crossed Father Matthias's face. The priest lowered his sword, knowing that his enemy spoke the truth. The cantor of no tongue was not a creature that could be killed or banished. He was a concept, an idea, a corruption of the human soul that would exist as long as there were men willing to commit atrocities in the name of their faith. As Heinrich's consciousness faded forever, he could hear the cantor's final words echoing in his mind. "Find new voices to carry my song, priest. Find new faithful to sing my hymns of madness. The war is eternal, and so am I." But the story of the cantor of no tongue was far from over. Even as Heinrich Mordian's body grew cold in the mud of St. Erasmus Ridge, the bronze-masked figure was already moving to a new position along the endless front lines. There were other companies to corrupt, other faithful soldiers to turn into instruments of atrocity. 3 days later, reports began to filter back to the Orthodox command of strange incidents in the shrine of the Martyrs sector. Soldiers were abandoning their posts without orders, walking calmly into enemy fire with smiles on their faces. Others were conducting unauthorized raids on neutral medical stations, claiming they had received divine visions commanding them to cleanse the unworthy. Father Matthias read these reports with growing horror, recognizing the unmistakable signature of the cantor's influence. The creature had not been destroyed or banished. It had simply moved on to fresh hunting grounds, like a plague seeking new hosts to infect with its particular brand of holy madness. The priest gathered his most trusted acolytes and set out for the shrine of the martyrs, hoping to arrive before the cantor's corruption could spread too far. But even as he traveled, he knew that he was fighting a battle that could never truly be won. For every cell of madness he cured, 2 more would spring up elsewhere. For every soldier he saved from the cantor's influence, 3 others would fall under its sway. This was the true horror of the Trench Crusade, Father Matthias realized as his transport crawled through the shell-torn landscape. Not the demons that poured through Hell-Gate Jerusalem, not the heretics who openly proclaimed their allegiance to darkness, but the corruption that could turn faith itself into a weapon of evil. The enemy was not just outside the gates of heaven. It was inside the hearts of the faithful, whispering lies that sounded like truth. As night fell over the battlefield, Father Matthias could see the glow of the corpse candles flickering in the distance. marking the positions of the Orthodox forces. Somewhere among those lights, he knew, the Cantor of No Tongue was already at work, singing his soundless songs of madness to soldiers who thought they were hearing the voice of God. The war would continue, as it had for 8 centuries. But now it was no longer just a battle between good and evil, faith and heresy, light and darkness. Now it was a battle for the very soul of faith itself, a struggle to determine whether righteousness would remain righteous or be twisted into something monstrous and unrecognizable. And in that battle, Father Matias feared the forces of corruption had already gained an insurmountable advantage. For they did not need to destroy faith, they only needed to redirect it, to turn its power against itself, until the faithful became their own worst enemies. The Cantor of No Tongue understood this truth better than anyone. He had found the perfect weapon against the Church, not doubt or despair, but certainty. The absolute certainty that allowed good men to commit evil acts while telling themselves they were heroes. The unshakable faith that made atrocity feel like righteousness. As Father Matias's transport approached the shrine of the martyrs, he could already hear the sound of singing drifting across the night air. Not the traditional hymns of the Orthodox Church, but something else. Something that made his skin crawl with its beautiful wrongness. The soldiers were already falling under the Cantor's spell, their voices raised in harmonious praise of their own corruption. The priest closed his eyes and said a prayer, not for victory but for understanding. How did you fight an enemy that used your own faith against you? How did you defeat a creature that grew stronger the more righteous you believed yourself to be? He had no answers, only the grim determination to try. Somewhere in the trenches ahead, the Cantor of No Tongue was weaving his web of holy madness, and Father Matias was perhaps the only man alive who understood the true scope of the threat. If he failed here, if he could not find a way to counter the Cantor's influence, then the corruption would spread throughout the Orthodox forces like a cancer, turning the entire Church into an instrument of its own destruction. The transport shuddered to a halt at the edge of the forward positions, and Father Matias climbed out into the cold night air. The sound of singing was louder now, and he could see soldiers moving between the trenches with that same expression of serene contentment he had witnessed at St. Erasmus Ridge. They were preparing for something, following orders that existed only in their corrupted minds. "Father," one of his acolytes whispered, "perhaps we should wait for reinforcements." Father Matias shook his head. "There is no time. Every moment we delay, more souls fall under his influence." He drew his blessed sword, feeling the familiar weight of the silver blade in his hand. "Stay back and observe. If I fail, you must carry word back to the bishop. The Church must know what we face." The priest walked alone into the forward trenches, his footsteps echoing strangely in the pre-dawn silence. The singing had stopped, but he could feel eyes watching him from the shadows, hundreds of corrupted soldiers waiting for some signal that only they could perceive. As he rounded a corner in the communications trench, Father Matias found himself face to face with the object of his hunt. The Cantor of No Tongue stood motionless in the center of a circle of kneeling soldiers, his bronze mask gleaming in the light of the corpse candles. The creature's robes hung perfectly still despite the wind that whistled through the trench system, and his eyeless gaze seemed to bore directly into Father Matias's soul. "You have come far to find me, priest." The Cantor's voice resonated inside Father Matias's skull, carrying undertones of amusement. "But you are too late. These faithful souls have already heard my song. They understand their true purpose now." Father Matias raised his sword, channeling all of his faith and training into the blessed blade. Holy light began to gather around the weapon, casting harsh shadows on the trench walls. "Your corruption ends here, abomination. I will not allow you to twist any more souls to your purpose." The Cantor tilted his head slightly, and Father Matias could swear he saw the creature smile despite the bronze mask that covered his mouth. "You misunderstand, priest. I do not twist souls. I simply reveal what was already there." These soldiers came to me already eager to commit violence in the name of their faith. I merely gave them permission to do so. The words hit Father Matias like a physical blow, because deep in his heart he recognized their truth. How many times had he himself felt the urge to strike down heretics with righteous fury? How many times had he justified violence by telling himself it was God's will? "You doubt," the cantor observed, his toneless voice filled with satisfaction. "Good. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom, but it is also the beginning of madness. Tell me, priest, how do you know that the voice you think is God's is not simply another version of mine?" Father Matias felt his certainty wavering, his faith beginning to crack under the weight of the cantor's questions. Around him, the kneeling soldiers began to rise, their faces turning toward him with expressions of predatory hunger. They were still smiling, still filled with that terrible contentment, but now their eyes held something else, the promise of violence sanctified by absolute faith. "You see?" the cantor continued, his voice growing stronger as Father Matias's doubt deepened. "Faith without question is madness. Faith without understanding is cruelty. Faith without wisdom is the very corruption you seek to fight. I am not the enemy of faith, priest. I am its inevitable conclusion." The blessed sword in Father Matias's hand began to dim, its holy light flickering like a candle in a hurricane. The soldiers were moving closer now, their weapons drawn, their faces radiant with the joy of the righteous about to do God's work. In their eyes, the priest realized, he was the heretic, the enemy of the faith who had come to stop them from fulfilling their sacred duty. "This is my gift to the church," the cantor whispered, his voice now coming from every direction at once. "I show the faithful what their faith truly means when stripped of doubt, when freed from the burden of conscience. I give them the courage to act on their deepest convictions without hesitation or regret." Father Matias tried to speak, tried to find words that would break through the cantor's spell, but his voice caught in his throat. How could he argue against faith? How could he tell these soldiers that their certainty was wrong, their righteousness corrupt, when certainty and righteousness were the very foundations of their church? The first soldier reached him, a young man no older than 20, his face shining with the light of absolute conviction. "Father," the soldier said gently, "you have been deceived by the enemy. You have allowed doubt to cloud your judgment. Let us help you remember what it means to have faith." The boy raised his rifle, and Father Matias could see his own death reflected in the weapon's blessed steel. There would be no struggle, no dramatic battle between good and evil. There would only be a faithful soldier doing what he believed God wanted him to do, killing a priest he had been convinced was a threat to the church. As the rifle's muzzle pressed against Father Matias's forehead, the priest finally understood the true horror of what they faced. The cantor of no tongue was not just corrupting individual soldiers. He was corrupting the very concept of faith itself. He was creating a version of righteousness so pure, so absolute, that it became indistinguishable from evil. "Wait," Father Matias whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own thundering heartbeat. "Before you pull that trigger, answer me one question. How do you know that what you're doing is right?" The young soldier's finger hesitated on the trigger, confusion flickering across his features. I know because I have faith." "But faith in what?" Father Matias pressed, seeing the crack in the boy's certainty. "Faith in a voice that speaks without words? Faith in a figure whose face is hidden behind bronze? Faith in feelings that came to you in the darkness, when your mind was tired and your soul was hungry for meaning?" The soldier's grip on his rifle began to shake. Around them, the other corrupted troops were growing agitated, sensing that their certainty was being challenged. But the cantor of no tongue remained perfectly still, his bronze mask reflecting the flickering corpse candles like a mirror of damnation. "I know what I heard," the boy insisted, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held moments before. I know what I felt. The warmth, the peace, the certainty that I was doing God's work. And did it never occur to you, Father Matias asked softly, that the enemy might be clever enough to use those very feelings against you? That the devil himself might come disguised as an angel of light, speaking words that sound like scripture but lead only to damnation? The rifle's muzzle trembled against Father Matthias's forehead as the young soldier struggled with concepts that his corrupted mind could barely grasp. For 8 centuries, the Church had taught its followers to trust their faith absolutely, to never question the voice of divine inspiration. But now that very teaching had become a weapon in the hands of their enemies. "You speak blasphemy," another soldier called out, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "Faith is faith. Righteousness is righteousness. There can be no doubt in the service of God." "Then why," Father Matthias asked, turning to face the man, "are you doubting now? Why do my words trouble you if your faith is truly pure?" A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers, doubt spreading like ripples in a pond. The Cantor of No Tongue raised one gloved hand, and Father Matthias felt the creature's influence pressing against his mind like a physical weight. "Enough," the Cantor's voice boomed inside their skulls. "This priest seeks to poison your souls with the venom of uncertainty. He would have you question everything, believe nothing, trust only in your own weak human judgment. Is this the faith your fathers died for? Is this the righteousness that has sustained the Church through 8 centuries of war?" The soldiers straightened, their weapons rising once more. But Father Matthias could see that the damage had been done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and even the Cantor's influence could not entirely erase it. "Listen to me." Father Matthias spoke quickly, knowing he had only moments before the creature's hold reasserted itself completely. "The voice you hear is not God's voice. The warmth you feel is not heaven's blessing. You have been deceived by something ancient and malevolent, something that feeds on the corruption of faith itself." "Lies," the Cantor whispered, but there was something different in his tone now, a note of desperation that had not been there before. "Pretty lies meant to destroy your certainty, to rob you of the strength that comes from absolute faith." But Father Matthias pressed on, his words cutting through the creature's influence like a blade through silk. "Look around you. Look at what your faith has led you to do. You have murdered men who were trying to surrender. You have slaughtered the innocent in the name of righteousness. You have become the very evil you were sworn to fight against." One by one, the soldiers began to lower their weapons, horror dawning on their faces as the Cantor's spell weakened. They looked at their hands as if seeing them for the first time, seeing the blood that stained them, remembering the acts they had committed while under the influence of that beautiful, terrible certainty. "No," one of them whispered, falling to his knees in the mud. "No, what have we done? What have we become?" The Cantor of No Tongue let out a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could be stripped of all joy and filled with infinite malice. "You see, priest, this is what doubt brings. Despair, self-hatred, the complete collapse of everything they believed in, which is truly more cruel. The beautiful certainty I offered them, or the ugly truth you have shown them." Father Matthias felt the weight of the creature's words, recognizing the terrible logic behind them. These soldiers would never recover from what they had done. The knowledge of their corruption would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives, driving them to madness or suicide or worse, in trying to save their souls, had he only damned them more completely. "Your doubt feeds me as much as their certainty ever did," the Cantor continued, his bronze mask gleaming with reflected firelight. "Doubt and faith are 2 faces of the same coin, priest. Both can be used to destroy the human soul. Both can be twisted into weapons of corruption." Around them, the soldiers were weeping now, their cries of anguish echoing through the trench system like the wails of the damned. Some were tearing at their uniforms, trying to remove the symbols of a faith they no longer trusted. Others were pressing their weapons to their own heads, seeking escape in death from the horror of what they had become. "Stop," Father Matias commanded, but his voice lacked authority. How could he tell them to have faith when faith itself had been revealed as a trap? How could he offer them hope when hope had been the very thing that led them into corruption? The cantor began to fade, his form becoming translucent in the flickering light of the corpse candles. "My work here is done," he said, his voice already sounding distant. "Whether they die in despair or live in madness matters little. Their souls are equally lost either way." "Wait," Father Matias called out desperately. "What are you? What do you want?" But the creature was already gone, leaving behind only the echo of words that seemed to come from the very walls of the trench itself. "I am what faith becomes when it loses its humanity. I am what righteousness becomes when it abandons mercy. I am the inevitable end of every crusade, every holy war, every righteous cause that values purity over compassion." Father Matias stood alone among the weeping soldiers, his blessed sword dim and useless in his hand. He had driven off the cantor of no tongue, but at what cost? The creature had been right about one thing. Doubt could be as destructive as certainty when taken to its extreme. As dawn broke over the shrine of the martyrs, Father Matias found himself facing a terrible choice. He could report what had happened here, warn the church about the cantor's corruption, try to develop defenses against the creature's influence. But doing so would require him to admit that faith itself could be turned into a weapon, that righteousness could become indistinguishable from evil, that the very foundations of their church were built on sand. Or he could remain silent, file a report about a localized outbreak of madness caused by enemy gas attacks or shell shock, and hope that the cantor would move on to other hunting grounds. It would be a lie, but it would preserve the faith of those who had not yet been touched by the creature's corruption. The choice paralyzed him. Either path seemed to lead to damnation, either for himself or for countless others who might fall victim to the cantor's influence in the future. He understood now why the creature had let him live, had allowed him to drive it away. The real corruption was not in the certainty it offered, but in the impossible choices it left behind. As Father Matias walked through the trenches, past soldiers who could no longer meet his eyes, past corpse candles that seemed to flicker with malevolent intelligence, he realized that the cantor of no tongue had already won, not through the corruption of faith, but through the corruption of doubt, not by making the righteous into monsters, but by making it impossible to tell the difference between righteousness and monstrosity. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of singing again. New voices, fresh and young and filled with the beautiful certainty that only the truly faithful possessed. The cantor had found new prey, new souls eager to serve God without question, new hearts ready to be filled with the warmth of absolute righteousness. Father Matias closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. How could he pray to a God whose voice might be indistinguishable from that of a demon? How could he trust his own faith when faith itself had been revealed as a snare? The war would continue, as it had for 8 centuries. Soldiers would die believing they were heroes, and others would die knowing they were monsters. The line between good and evil would blur until no one could see it clearly, and the cantor of no tongue would move through the chaos like a plague, singing his soundless songs to anyone willing to listen. And in the end, Father Matias realized the creature's greatest victory was not in the souls it corrupted, but in the souls it left behind. The ones who survived its touch would spend the rest of their lives questioning everything, trusting nothing, paralyzed by the knowledge that any certainty might be false, any righteousness might be corrupted. The bronze-masked figure was already gone, already seeking new voices to carry his song of beautiful damnation. But his influence would linger long after his departure, spreading through the ranks of the faithful like a cancer that fed on the very act of trying to cut it out. Father Matias opened his eyes and looked up at the gray sky. where the stars were fading in the light of dawn. Somewhere among those distant lights, he knew God was watching. But whether the divine gaze held love or hatred, mercy or judgment, he could no longer say. The only certainty left was uncertainty itself, and even that felt like another trap laid by the Cantor of No Tongue. In trying to save faith from corruption, the creature had corrupted the very act of salvation. In trying to preserve righteousness from evil, it had made righteousness and evil indistinguishable. As the sun rose over the battlefield, casting long shadows across the cratered earth, Father Matias began to walk back toward the rear lines. Behind him, the soldiers continued to weep for sins they could no longer undo, for a faith they could no longer trust, for a God they could no longer hear above the echo of bronze laughter. The war would go on, and men would continue to die for causes they believed were holy. But now, in the deepest trenches of the human heart, a new kind of battle had begun. Not between armies or faiths or nations, but between the need to believe and the fear of being deceived, between the hunger for certainty and the terror of its consequences. And in that battle, the Cantor of No Tongue had already claimed victory, not through the corruption of souls, but through the corruption of the very idea that souls could be saved at all. The last thing Father Matias heard as he left the forward trenches was the sound of singing, beautiful and terrible and perfectly silent, carried on a wind that tasted of bronze and blood and the ashes of burned faith. It was a song without words, a hymn without hope, a prayer that answered itself with damnation. And deep in his heart, despite everything he knew, despite everything he had seen, Father Matias found himself humming along,